My purpose is to tell you about the current status of the nuclear weapons, the plutonium-producing facility in Hanford, Washington. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation is located about 200 miles east of Portland. Portland is actually on the Columbia River, which you can see here, and the Columbia River goes right through the nuclear reservation, and all of the plutonium-producing reactors were located in immediate proximity to the river. The nuclear reservation is about 525 square miles. So you can think of it, if it were a square, it would be 25 by 25 miles. So quite a large site, and it's on both sides of the river, but all the activity occurred on the south side. The reservation can be divided into three major components: the river corridor, where all of the reactors were located; the central plateau, where processing facilities were located. You may know that the process is to irradiate the uranium so that the uranium is converted into plutonium, but only a tiny fraction of the irradiated fuel becomes plutonium. They then dissolve it in nitric acid and extract the plutonium from the nitrates, and then the remainder of it is waste, which they put into tanks underground. So the central plateau contained all these facilities that extracted the plutonium, and then the third component of the site for our concerns is the tank waste, which amounts to 56 million gallons. I just have to give you some highlights that are the data that are most important about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. First, there are around 1,000 or so waste sites that need to be dealt with. 44 billion gallons of contaminated water was dumped onto the soil in the Hanford Reservation. A lot of this was single pass through the reactors, but a great deal of it was more heavily contaminated waste out of the processing plants. 56 million gallons of extremely hazardous waste is located in 177 tanks, 149 of which are single shell and 28 double shell tanks. An estimated 67 of the single shell tanks have leaked an estimated 1 million gallons of toxic waste to the soil. During the past 25 years, when the cleanup has been going on, 16 of the 149 tanks have been emptied. So you can see, if they continue at the present rate, it will simply take forever to get the job done. Shoreline burial ground sites will be largely cleaned up, and one of the biggest components of the toxics in that site is hexavalent chromium, not a radioactive material. The hexavalent chromium was used to prevent corrosion in the pipes within the reactor. So there was a great deal of it, and there were many spills of this which they didn't pay much attention to. They just, they ignored it. They did not try to clean it up until recently. And I'll show you the cleanup going on now. Remaining along the river are the reactors, which have, all but 2 of them have been cocooned. So they're put in more or less airtight structures, and they're planning to wait 75 years for the reactors to cool off before they dismantle them. All the fuel has been removed, but the shell of the reactor core is still radioactive, and that's why they're leaving it there. They are building a vitrification plant. The objective is to mix the radioactive material with essentially sand and convert it into glass. The reason for doing that is that glass it doesn't dissolve in water, so it's stable chemically, and also it's not going to turn into dust, which might blow away in the wind. So it's chemically and physically stable material, and the plan is eventually to put it deep underground. That would be a stable solution. As has been mentioned, you never get rid of this stuff, but you can put it in a place that is relatively safe. That's the plan. Okay, here's a typical cleanup scenario. On the upper left, you see the many buildings that were part of this processing plant. This is not a reactor, but a plant that turned the plutonium nitrate into hockey puck-sized, Canadians know all about hockey pucks, hockey puck-sized buttons of plutonium metal. And that was then shipped elsewhere to be made into the components of bombs. As you can see, the cleanup involved removal of a lot of buildings, and you can see here that there are deep trenches that were dug. That was to dig out the chromium, and they had to dig all the way down to the groundwater to get that out. So that's a typical cleanup, but the appearance is deceptive because there's still a lot of contamination underground in what they called cribs and trenches. A crib was simply an artificial pond into which they dumped contaminated liquid, and trenches served the same purpose. They just ran out of storage space in the tanks, so they dug these cribs and trenches and poured the radioactive and otherwise toxic liquid into those locations and then just covered them up. So that stuff is still there. They found a spill under one of the buildings called the 324 building that was so hot. On the surface of it, it measured 9,000 rads per hour. And just for context, 400 rads is a lethal dose of radiation. So this is very hot indeed. Here are some other facts. The groundwater contaminant plumes contain a lot of different stuff, and I've just listed some here. Chromium, nitrate, tritium, which is a 12.5-year half-life, strontium-90, uranium, plutonium, and there are a bunch of other isotopes, radioactive isotopes in there. These groundwater plumes are complex. You can see here the purple is tritium, the red is strontium, the orange uranium, well, I guess there's another reddish, which is technetium, and the green is iodine. Now, these plumes are moving through the soil, and their mobility is different. So they're working their way down to the groundwater through this zone, which the geologists call the vadose zone. So the contaminants work their way down, and then in the groundwater, they head toward the Columbia River. But the situation is complex because as the river rises, the flow is back into the plateau, and when the river is low, it goes toward the river. So there's a periodic re-wetted zone from which these contaminants are wet over and over again, and it tends to wash them eventually toward the river. Here's an aerial view of that central plateau area. And each of these red flags is a so-called tank farm, a location that has multiple underground tanks. The tanks are actually, they range from several 100,000 gallons up to about 1 million gallons. All of the 28 double shell tanks are the 1 million gallon size. So here's the status of the waste in the tanks. I've already mentioned that there are 149 of them in 12 farms. By 1950, they knew that some of these tanks were leaking, and they were designed to last just 30 years. Now, there are 67 known or suspected leaking tanks that have leaked already 1 million gallons. When they became aware that these single shell tanks were no longer intact, they stuck pipes down in and pumped out all the pumpable liquids and put it into the double shell tanks. So that helps. And the plan is, and they're starting to work now, removing the solids from the tanks, but the law requires them to remove 99%. And I'll just call to your attention, if you've got 1 million curies in a tank and you remove 99%, you still have 10,000 curies in the tank. So the Department of Ecology of the state of Washington, once the 99% has been removed, will sample the contents of the tank and then make a decision as to whether they can safely discontinue the cleaning out of that tank. And we've got to hope that they do their job well. One of the double shell tanks has started to leak, not to the environment, but to the space between the two tanks. But nevertheless, that event mandates emptying that tank. They don't have another 1 million gallons of tank space. So, well, they're going to deal with it in a very complex way, and there just isn't time to go into that. Here's another look at the same Central Plateau area, and I call your attention to this area at the bottom. This is the site of a $13.5 billion construction of the vitrification plant that's supposed to turn this waste into glass. Slight problem occurred in that, oh, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So here's the first tank farm that they have, on which they have undertaken to empty all of the tanks, at least down to 99%. And you can see the ones in the green are the ones that they have achieved that. And the others, the blues, they're working on, but they haven't yet emptied them. There was a federal court decision saying that they had to empty those tanks by 2014. And like a lot of the other mandated milestones, they're missing them one after the other. And the Department of Energy, although they're bad enough, they're not as bad as the US Congress, because the Congress is not providing money for the Department of Energy to do the tasks, even those mandated by a federal court. So I don't know where you go from there. Here's the next tank farm to be emptied, and it's got a lot more radioactive activity than that first one, which was selected to begin the task because it was an easy one. Here's the waste treatment plant that I was talking about, the vitrification plant. And I call your attention to this pre-treatment facility. That was where all the waste was to go and be separated into a high activity and low activity stream because they're dealt with in different ways. The construction on this plant has been shut down because it was determined that some of the vessels into which they were going to pump this activity might not be sufficiently stirred, and the particulate plutonium might settle to the bottom of the tank, and there was a chance that it would go critical, namely that it would blow up. So they've had to stop it. Secretary Chu, the previous Secretary of Energy, convened a blue ribbon panel to study the situation, but all the members of the blue ribbon panel had to sign non-disclosure agreements. And for 2 years, we've been trying to find out what they found and what they recommended, and we have been unable to get the Department of Energy to release that information. So, typical behavior, secrecy, and lies. This building, I think, is the most dangerous building on the site. It contains cesium and strontium capsules, a large number of them, and it contains 60 million curies of radioactivity. Cesium is so radioactive that it generates heat, and a lot of heat. And so these capsules have to be kept in a pool, in various pools, and those pools have to be refrigerated in order to keep the water eventually from boiling. The dangers are obvious. If there was an earthquake and they lost the water, it would be a disaster because the cesium would first boil off any remaining water, and then it would heat up enough to catch fire. You wouldn't be able to approach the building because it's too hot, and that is too radioactive for firefighters to get anywhere near it. They wouldn't get to within 100 yards of it without receiving a lethal dose in a very short time. So, I'm going to stop talking about the site, and just the last 2 slides are just on cost. This is the money already spent. $115 billion has been spent up to this point on the cleanup. It is estimated that another, well, at the time I made the slide, it was $113 billion to complete the task. But look, every single year it goes up. I think the current estimate is $120 billion, and it'll end up being, you can bet your boots it'll be $200 billion or more, and it'll take 50 years or more to do this job. This is the amount of money that would be necessary each year in order to accomplish the tasks that will get it done by 2090. This is the amount of money here. We're getting about $2 billion a year. $2.2 billion per year is what has been authorized. So all these years are going to have a very significant shortfall that will either enormously increase the amount that they're going to have to get later on, or what's more likely, it will just prolong the task. So 2090 is not when this job is going to finish up, if it ever is. The big point is there is no reasonable solution to dealing with nuclear wastes. The only possibility that is viable is that we stop generating them.
Well, thank you first to the conference organizers, and thank you to the local people for inviting me onto your land, so forth. I just wanted to talk to you for a bit about depleted uranium weapons. I've had a brief introduction, which rather renders this slide useless, but yeah, we were launched in 2003, and our aim was to develop a treaty ban on depleted uranium weapons. Treaties banning landmines and cluster munitions, but as yet, nothing on DU. We currently have 160 members in 30 countries, and one of the reasons we were launched was to take an evidence-based approach to the issue, an issue which has been dogged by all sorts of sensationalism, which seems to have been a bit of a post-9/11 thing in the US primarily, but it's caused a lot of damage to the issue over the years, so we're always very cautious in our approach. I've now added to that slide that we've got ECOSOC accreditation at the UN, which is very exciting and only happened yesterday after 5 years of trying to get ECOSOC status. Thank you very much. It's official consultative status at the UN, so you can register your own name badge at the UN and stuff like that. But a country who may or may not have been China was vigorously opposed to us because we had something on our website about the Dalai Lama being against EU weapons. And for that reason, it's taken us 5 whole years to get accredited. So the Dalai Lama article's going back up on the website tomorrow. And yeah, anyway, I shall crack on. DU weapons. This one at the top is a 105mm tank round. And basically just a solid rod of uranium metal. So DU is what's left over after uranium enrichment when the U235 is removed for nuclear weapons and nuclear power. You end up with an awful lot of DU. It's very dense, about as dense as the gold in your wedding ring if you happen to be wearing one. It's pyrophoric, which means when it's finely ground, it spontaneously combusts in presence of oxygen. And the class of weapons are called kinetic energy penetrators. So it's not rocket science. It's firing something which is very dense at very high velocity in order to pierce armor. And you also get this secondary incendiary effect from the burning uranium particles as well. But that's one of the reasons why they're quite problematic, which I'll come back to in a second. So the platforms that use them, there's the A-10 gunship up there. It's Harrier jets, which been phased out for that, which is good. Armored fighting vehicles in the middle, and then tanks. So it's a range of calibers and sizes from about 25 millimeters up to 125 millimeters. 125 millimeters, it's about 6-7 kilograms of uranium. And the smaller rounds, about 280 grams of depleted uranium. So there are 6 countries who manufacture, which are the Permanent 5 Security Council members, so US, UK, France, Russia, China, and Pakistan as well. Around 20 countries are thought to have them in their stockpiles. There's a load who got them from the US, and there's a load who got them from Russia, basically. But keep an eye on that A-10 gunship up at the top, because we'll be coming back to that later. So the main issues with DU, as I mentioned, it's pyrophoric, so it can generate a fine powder of small particles which can be inhaled. The high temperature fires you get when DU impacts, if you imagine you're firing something at very high velocity into something made of metal, it creates a very high temperature fire which can create very small particles which are readily inhaled. These small particles as well can be very environmentally persistent. There's been some studies out last year from UK firing ranges where the particles had remained pretty much unaltered for 30 years, and that's in the northwest of England, which is wet, fairly cold. One of the problems we've had is that there's been a lack of decent health studies on civilians. There's a number of reasons for that, but you'll probably know from your work on trying to do epidemiology or health studies around uranium mines or whatever else that it's actually quite complicated. Translate that to a post-conflict setting and it suddenly becomes extremely complicated, particularly where states that use the weapons are unwilling to release targeting data for where they're used. So unless you have that, it makes it very difficult to do meaningful studies. So another key issue, obviously, I've been doing a lot of presentations to arms control sort of campaigners recently. It's quite good to do one for campaigners for whom you don't have to persuade that firing uranium around is probably a bad idea in principle, so I'm glad about that. Interesting stuff for research on DU. At the time when it was first used, there was very little known, really. There's kind of the initial uranium toxicity studies going back to the 50s, but they tended to be on uranium rather than depleted uranium. They also tend to focus on lung cancer risks and kidney damage. Over the last 10 years, there's been a lot more research, mainly because of concerns about the health impact of DU, and that's highlighted the genotoxic and carcinogenic properties of DU, which are from its chemical toxicity and radioactivity. We've got a load of them in that purple report on the end of the table there. I would be indebted if you'd take some, because I really don't want to carry them back to the UK, because they were really heavy on the way here. But it's been quite interesting. But again, at the same time, it's mostly laboratory studies. It's not civilian health studies. But the fact that we know that DU can potentially cause these problems rather underscores the need for more civilian exposure studies. This is the thing. DU, it's always promoted as an anti-armor weapon primarily. It's for tanks, to destroy other tanks. And while that was kind of true originally, the nature of conflict more recently has seen it used against a far wider range of targets. And that A-10 aircraft I was pointing at earlier, they've been very widely used in Iraq, and they've been fulfilling a close air support role. And so they've just been attacking all sorts of things, from unmounted troops to buildings, light vehicles. And yet the states that use the weapons are always very keen to say this is just an anti-armor weapon, only for destroying tanks, but the reality is very different. And obviously, if you're destroying buildings, then there's a much higher chance that civilians will be exposed after the conflict. Let's go back one. Leading on from that, DU was originally developed in the 60s and 70s, and it was kind of a Cold War weapon. They were thinking of a huge conflagration between East and West, destroying tanks on the battlefields of Europe. In that kind of conflict, it was probably a bit moot if there were some areas of uranium contamination afterwards. But subsequently, it was used in Iraq, the Balkans, elsewhere, and these are very different conflicts. And in 1976, before the A-10's ammunition came in, there was a legal review for the weapons, as you tend to get before weapons are deployed. And even at the time, they were saying, well, it shouldn't be used in populated areas for a number of reasons, not least the fact it's also incendiary, but also radiation exposure. Obviously, that's been completely ignored in Iraq, where it's been quite widely used in densely populated areas. Transparency, I mentioned this before. So we've had a number of UN resolutions, which I'll come on to in a minute. And one of the key issues is that if you want to clear DU, if you want to avoid civilian exposure, if you want to understand whether it's affecting civilians, and also if you want to understand how the weapons are being used, then you need transparency from the users about where they fire them. We've managed to get hold of a small number of coordinates from Iraq, and these support the fact that the weapons are being used against quite a wide range of targets. But yeah, the US has refused to transfer data to the Iraqi government, to the UN Environment Programme, to us, and anybody else. For Iraq in 2003, we have demining organizations that we're working with. They tend to have a very low awareness of DU, so we've been rewriting the technical guidelines for DU clearance. But yeah, it's very hard for them to do meaningful clearance work without knowing where the weapons are. Which gets you onto the management of DU. Obviously, managing any radioactive waste tends to be quite expensive, and that's certainly the case in Iraq and elsewhere. And if you think in a post-conflict environment with very little governmental control or oversight, then simple things like, do you have hazardous waste storage facilities? In the case of Bosnia, Kosovo, they didn't. They were wondering what to do with the stuff that had been collected. Is there technical and analytical capacity available? In Iraq, there's a huge brain drain of experts from the country. The Ministry of Environment lacked technical knowledge to be able to identify contaminated sites and deal with them. And most problematically, really, there are no legal obligations on the users of states to actually assist those who've been affected by them. So all these things, if it's not being dealt with after conflict, increases the risk of civilian exposure. Psychosocial impact. This is something we've come across in Bosnia and also in Iraq, that obviously the presence of radiation in the environment is very worrying for communities. Our colleagues who've been clearing cluster bombs in Serbia, where DU was also used, they've gone in, and the local communities are a lot more concerned about the presence of DU than they are about cluster munitions, and that's despite the fact the Serbian government actually did quite well in clearing DU.
U-238 is 99% of the crap that comes out of a uranium mine. Less than 1% goes into the nuclear power plants and bombs, etc. So we're talking about 99% of garbage, and they say, what do we do with this garbage? Hey, let's make weapons and let's spread that garbage all over the world, all of our enemies. That the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion, I say billion years. So that means it never goes away. And the alpha radiation is highly carcinogenic and mutagenic. We don't hear about the children in Iraq playing around these tanks, developing leukemias, the mothers whose fetuses come out deformed because of exposure, but nobody knows why. Because it's invisible. Alpha radiation, invisible. But these are lethal weapons of mass destruction. And I admire you guys for doing your work. I'd like to do the questioning from the audience on what kind of statement we can make, what kind of recommendations we can make after these two wonderful and very, very saddening presentations, but heroic presentations by the activists who have been presenting this afternoon. So what can we say about Hanford?
Comment too. A great deal of the depleted uranium in the U.S. is in the form of uranium hexafluoride, which is a uranium hexafluoride, yes. And it is, it's an extremely dangerous chemical. It will catch fire spontaneously. So the hex, as they call it, is contained in metallic containers, and there are tremendous deposits of this stuff in relatively insecure locations. And these containers, like the underground tanks at Hanford, have an engineered expected life. And they're reaching the end of that life, or many of them have already exceeded it. So it's a very unstable and dangerous situation, and the amount of the stuff is just staggering.
Yeah, the whole naming thing, we've got a load of documents from the 60s and 70s, and they're kind of scratching their heads going, can we call it depleted uranium? How about Q-metal, stabaloy, and all these other crazy names which sound a little bit less scary than depleted uranium, but particularly on the radioactivity of DU. Whenever you see an official IAEA report on DU in Iraq or whatever, it always says 14.6 megabecquerels per gram. It gives the figures for just VU238, VU235, and VU234 in depleted uranium fresh from the enrichment plant. But none of the DU in use is fresh from the enrichment plant. It's been sitting around for years, most of it. And as you know, DU gets more radioactive with age. After 3 or 4 months, it's up to 85% of natural uranium, and obviously it's in a far more concentrated form than natural uranium being in metal. There's all these little kind of smokes and mirrors things around how DU is promoted or explained away by the authorities.
Yes, language is very important to make sure that the population doesn't become too anxious or worried. It's our job to make people anxious or worried, but not to the point of inactivity. It's the point of action, being well informed, use the language of empowerment so we can create change, so we can turn some of these horrific situations of the nuclear weapons age around and give hope instead of panic and fear. And I commend our 2 speakers for their activism, intelligence, and the effort they made here to come here and speak to us today. Would you give them a warm well? Thank you.